April 13th. This date probably doesn't ring any bells to you, but it does to me because it's my birthday. And I wonder what else happened on my birthday. Well, I did some research and I discovered some interesting events that happened on April 13th. Through this speech, I will be talking about the $2 bill and events like the Apollo 13 explosion and even a beauty queen killer. Now, when you think of my birthday, you will no longer just think of my birthday, but you think of these extraordinary events that went down in history that are very unforgettable. First, let's talk about the remarkable $2 bill. I found an article on sweet101.com called $2 Bill, Fact and Fiction by Jonah Mock. This article states that the $2 bill has been around for 150 years and was made on April 13, 1862, with Alexander Hamilton on the front of it. Since then, the $2 bill has had many changes to it. Hamilton was first on the bill, and then came Thomas Jefferson. Then followed Civil War General Winfield Scott Hancock. In 1891, it changed to Treasury Secretary William Windom. In 1899 came around, and George Washington appeared on it. But in 1918, Jefferson returned on the bill, and it has been that way since. What is very bizarre is that Thomas Jefferson's birthday is also on April 13th. And remember, that is exactly the same day the $2 bill was made. Ironic, huh? This article also states that paper bills are printed according to demand. $2 bills are not high in demand, therefore they come in smaller quantities. In fact, approximately 1% of all paper bills are $2 bills. My second discovery about April 13th was the Apollo 13 spacecraft event. To begin my research, I went to elm4u.org database, which directed me to Encyclopedia Britannica Online. I found an article called Apollo 13. It stated that astronauts James Lovell Jr., John Swigert Jr., and Fred Hayes Jr. were aboard when it planned to set off for the third planned lunar landing mission on April 11, 1970. The first part of the flight went fairly smooth, but the evening of April 13th came around, and all of a sudden something terrible had happened. Moments after their live television broadcast from space, the famous quote by John Swigert, "Okay, Houston, we have a problem," was born. The mission changed from a routine flight into a race for survival. 56 hours into the mission, the oxygen tank had exploded. It knocked out the electricity, the light, the water supply, oxygen, and even heat. According to Wired.com, an article by Tony Long says, Apollo 13 was 200,000 miles from Earth and 87 hours from home. Unfortunately, the explosion knocked off the navigation system, so the astronauts had to use the sun to guide the spacecraft home. But good news was, the crew of Apollo 13 returned safely back to Earth, accomplishing one of the most dangerous adventures that ever went down in history. Moving on to my third and final topic, the beauty queen killer. Christopher Wilder, the killer, committed suicide on the 13th of April. According to newsok.com, Wilder was a millionaire electrical contractor from Florida that raced cars as a hobby. He sounds like a normal man, right? Well, I found an article from murderpedia.org by Juan Blanco. It stated that he raped, tortured, and killed more than 8 women. His murder spree reached from Florida to California and back to upstate New York. It was to the memory of many agents the most intense manhunt ever conducted, said Chris Mazzella, a spokesman for the FBI's Miami office, who was in charge of the Wilder investigation. The abduction started February 26. He preyed on young, beautiful women. And one example of his demented mind was when a 19-year-old girl declined his request to take pictures of her for a modeling agency. He then beat her, wrapped her in a blanket, threw her in the trunk, and brought her to a motel. There he raped her, glued her eyes shut, and applied copper wire to the bottom of her feet and sent an electrical current through them. Luckily, this 19-year-old girl got away when she locked herself in the bathroom and screamed for help. Sounds horrible, right? Well, this was only the beginning of his terrible spree. After this, he also killed 6 more beautiful young women. But on April 13th, the killing spree came to a halt when 2 state troopers recognized him at a service station from the FBI descriptions. As they called out to him, he dove into his vehicle for a gun and shot himself in the heart. He died instantly. It was April 13th when he committed suicide. It had been 47 days since the first disappearance had been reported. His luck had just run out. There are probably many more events that have occurred on April 13th, but the 3 that I presented to you are the ones that caught my attention. Now, when April 13th comes around, you will no longer think of my birthday. This day will remind you of how significant it is in our history. April 13th is the day the $2 bill was made. Though it is used less frequently, it is still a very important part of our history. The Apollo 13 explosion is an event no American will ever forget, and the Christopher Wilder murder spree is a heart-wrenching tragedy that ceased suddenly on April 13th with his suicide after killing 8 innocent young women. All in all, these events will never be forgotten in history on the day of April 13th. Thank you.
Yeah.